Well, good day. Why are we here today? Let's start by posing that question to you all. Let me start with this. Let's just think about last night, for example. Last night in, say, Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, a woman was beaten up by her husband. Why? Well, he didn't like how dinner was cooked. He beat her up. And of course, that woman wasn't alone, because just last night around the world, hundreds of thousands of women were hit by a spouse, by a boyfriend. Last night in, say, Frankfurt, a woman from Russia was threatened. If she didn't have sex with some series of men, they told her that her family back in Russia would be harmed. And of course, that woman felt very much alone. But she wasn't alone, because across Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, thousands and thousands of women and girls and some boys are trafficked every year into prostitution. Last night in, say, Rio de Janeiro, in a fashionable neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro, a woman was sexually assaulted by her husband. He wanted to have sex, she did not. He said, "It's my right," and so he raped her. Afterwards, he said, "That's better, and good night." She lay in their marital bed feeling very much alone, but of course, she wasn't alone, because last night, thousands and thousands of women around the world were sexually assaulted. This morning, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there was probably a village where soldiers, some as young as 14, marched into this village, and they assaulted every single woman and girl, and some of the men and boys as well. And this has been a pattern repeated in times of conquest and war right around the world. This morning in an office in Toronto, Canada, where I live, a woman is being sexually harassed, made to feel uncomfortable by jokes or by looks or by comments that are meant just to, as a joke, meant to supposedly make her feel comfortable and good, but are doing the opposite, making her feel very much uncomfortable. And she, of course, is not alone. And right here, somewhere right out there, right out those windows in Dublin, you could zoom in on one of the windows in the offices or factories or apartment buildings. Somewhere out there, there's a woman. There's a woman who is sitting at her desk at work who can't concentrate on the work. There's a woman who's sitting at her desk at school and cannot concentrate on what she's doing. There's a woman sitting at home unable to concentrate on whatever she's trying to do, and she can't concentrate because she is living in fear. She is living in fear that tonight, when her husband or boyfriend comes home from work, that tonight will be the night that he finally kills her. And if he does, she will not be alone. I started off by asking why we are here today. Is it because of the women who wake up in pain, who live in fear, or the ones who don't wake up at all? Well, of course, that is why we're here. But I'd like to suggest it is not only that. Nor is it simply because women have faced discrimination in societies around the world for thousands of years. Women as second-class citizens. It's a good reason to be here, but it's not, in a way, the main reason, as you'll see. It could be because of the staggering economic costs of the violence. You know, at times when we're facing economic crises and government cutbacks, if we were just to get rid of violence against women, we'd have a national economic salvation. In the UK, for example, a study a few years ago looked at the economic costs of violence against women. And they did two calculations. One was the direct cost of the violence, police services, courts, prisons, social services, healthcare. And they found out that the direct cost of the violence, what it's costing government, basically, was £5.8 billion a year. £5.8 billion a year. They estimated the indirect costs, including lost work time in particular, lost productivity. Now their estimate of that was that the annual cost, plus those direct costs, was £23 billion a year. Now, your department could do with that. But that would be a good reason to be here, just the sheer economic cost of the violence. That's not the main reason. Are we here because of the emotional cost of the violence? After all, the greatest scar of men's violence against women is a psychological trauma that lingers on after the physical wounds have healed. The loss of self-esteem, the constant fear the woman feels in her own home, the feeling that her life isn't important, that her life is worthless, and no one cares. None of those feelings is ever far away. Is it because of the degrading images of women in the media that brings us here? And I don't just mean pornography. I mean the everyday, the day in, day out images that are there, whether a woman has her clothes on or off. That would be a good reason to be here. But I'd like to suggest it's not the main reason. Is it because of the impact of domestic violence on children? What we know from research all over the world is that the impact on a child who witnesses violence in the home, who witnesses violence against someone that he or she loves, is as if the violence is happening directly against them. In other words, witnessing violence by a young child is an experience of violence. That would be a good reason to be here. Is it because violence against women is the #1 cause of death of women around the world, 15 to 44? That would be a good reason. Is it because of the girls around the world, including here in Europe, whose genitals have been mutilated in the names of tradition? Is it because all forms of violence against women are an abrogation of the human rights, not only of those women who directly experience the violence, but of all women who have to live in fear that this could happen to them? Is it because violence against our mothers, our sisters, our daughters, our friends tarnishes the honor of our communities, tarnishes the honor of our countries? Are we here because of the doctor or the nurse who fails to properly respond to the woman who comes in to the emergency department with a report that she's been assaulted? Or the police officer who isn't trained to react properly, who humiliates a woman even further? Are we here because of the woman who wants to desperately wants to flee an abusive partner and doesn't have services or doesn't know how to access those services? Because of the teachers who aren't trained to spot abuse? Because of countries around the world that ignore rape of women in prisons? Because of religious leaders who justify, not to only ignore, but have justified violence against women? Are we here because there's countries that still don't have adequate laws, or if they have adequate laws, don't implement those laws? Are we here because many governments haven't worked effectively with women's organizations? Are we here because too many men and boys still think it is their right to hit a woman, to abuse a woman, to assault a woman? Are we here because there still are some women and girls who still think it's just the way it is? Well, there are many reasons that we could be here. In fact, all this litany of horrors are indeed the reasons why we're here. But what I'd like to suggest to you is none of this is the main reason why we're here. It sounds a bit weird, but I'd like to suggest this. All these things I've been talking about, and we could spend days and days and days talking about all these different forms of men's violence against women, and tease out how they work, what are the different aspects of them. They're all real, and they all deserve that attention. But what I'd like to suggest is those things are not something created by Mother Nature, but they're created by the actions of some men. I think we are here today because through the heroic efforts of women's organizations here in Ireland and around the world, increasingly the efforts of governments around the world, increasingly the efforts of men and men's groups, we're actually bringing the violence to an end. In other words, I don't think we're here primarily today because of a problem. I think we're actually here today because we are working together to bring that problem to an end. And that makes this day a very different day. If it was only a day about the problem, it would just be, it would be a pretty awful slice of life. A slice of life that many people in this room deal with all the time. But it's actually a very positive day, because it's not only about understanding a problem, but understanding how we are working together to bring this problem to an end. Now, why can I say with such confidence that we are bringing this problem to an end? I mean, are we sort of diluted in Canada? Like, do they put something in our water over there that makes us imagine fantastic things that aren't quite happening? Well, here's why I'm confident that actually that's what brings us together. First of all, women all over the world have said no. have said no to the violence, have stood up, heroic women standing up in their relationships, in society as a whole, speaking out, and including and pushing governments to change laws to recognize their concerns, the things that have happened in the past. And right here in this room, we have women. We have women in this room. And at the risk of embarrassing some of the women in this room, I'd just like to ask the women, particularly just women, any women in this room who over the past, whatever it is, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, has worked to end violence against women, to provide support services for women, has worked lobbying for change, whatever it is, could I just ask you for 1 second to stand up? Those of you who have worked in the violence. Please stand up. And can we show you our appreciation? Well, that's the first reason why I'm confident that change is happening, because women have been making this change happen and have been the leaders in the movement for change and will continue to be the leaders. The second reason why I'm confident that this change is happening is that more and more governments are taking action. Governments all over the world are passing laws, are reassessing laws, or involved in training programs. I've been off and on doing some work in Turkey over the last number of years, and some amazing programs. Training, there's one program that is training all police officers in Turkey to respond in productive and proper ways to reports of violence against women. And I mean an in-depth training program. It started off with a train-the-trainer program that lasted a year of senior officers. I mean, this is serious, serious stuff. Every man now going into the Turkish army, which is every man in Turkey, goes through 1 day of work which looks at relationships, healthy relationships, and so forth, including ending violence against women. So different countries are taking this seriously, even though they still have big problems. The third reason why I'm confident we're changing is I don't believe that violence against women is inevitable. I'll talk about that more in just 1 minute. And the final reason why I'm confident that we are bringing the violence to an end is that more and more men are now speaking out against the violence. In the past, we've had, a majority of men who may not use violence in their relationships, but have been silent. And through our silence, we have allowed the violence to continue. And now with campaigns like the White Ribbon Campaign, with activities by organizations, as here in Ireland, what we're seeing more and more around the world is that men are finally stepping up and standing alongside our sisters and saying no. Yes, we have a terrible problem, but we also have the capacity to change the problem, to bring this problem to an end. But the question comes up, well, how? How? Why? Well, one of the big parts of that answer is not jumping into, oh, well, we should do this activity and we should have this campaign and that. But whatever we do has to be grounded, whether it's campaign work, whether it's work with men who use violence, whether it's public advocacy, whether it's changing our legal framework, training of judges and police, whatever it might be. It has to be grounded in an analysis of why some men use violence in their relationships. And by the way, let me just point out one thing right at the beginning here. Have you noticed the language that I've been using? You haven't heard me refer to violent men, have you? Or I haven't referred to perpetrators. Now, there are individual men who do perpetrate violence in the sense that they commit violence. But I don't like that language, because I think what it does is it does two things. If we just say to someone, you're a perpetrator, what we do is we reduce the whole range of what he is in life to one thing that he does. And not only it makes it very hard to connect to him as a person who is capable of change, but it also does two other things. It lets him off the hook in a way. If I just, can I point to you? Just grab you in the front here. You're a perpetrator. It's like, that's who you are. It's like, well, that's who I am. I'm just like that. I'm just violent. There's no room to change. The other problem with it, if I just label, oh, he's a perpetrator, I'm okay. I don't have to question my beliefs, my words, my attitudes, because I know I don't go home and beat up my wife, so I must be just fine. So I put those group of men, that minority, into this category, and they can be this sort of nice, tidy category, the bad guys that we can deal with or stuff in prison, but they're over there. And so I don't like that word, because I prefer to use the language of men who use violence, because they're choosing to use violence in their lives. It may be an unconscious choice. But they are selected, a man who beats up his wife, a man who commits sexual assault, is choosing who to be violent against. They're not beating up the copper on the way home from work. They're not beating up a workmate usually. They're choosing who to be violent against. They're using it as a tool. We're going to be talking about that more in a minute. So I prefer to use the language of men who use violence rather than just refer to violent men or the perpetrators. We'll return to that. Well, in order to end the violence, we have to know what's happening. And of course, there's been a long debate, a long time discussion on the origins and nature of men's violence. And just very quickly, as you all know, that debate has broken down into two arguments. There are those who just say it's biological, it's nature, it's in our genes. Not these genes, but it's our genes, our chromosomes. And then there's another argument that just says, no, it's about society, it's how we live, how we raise children, and so forth. That's the old nature versus nurture debate. We've all had that argument about many things, of course. Well, let's just look at that very quickly in relation to men's violence and see if we have evidence leaning one way or the other. Well, there is a bit of evidence that actually says it is nature. And the evidence is pretty clear. Humans, in general, and it appears men in particular, have a biological capacity to be violent against other humans. That's part of, sadly, that's part of our human birthright. That's true. We are biologically capable of using violence. Not all animals are capable of using violence against other members of their species. We are, it's a drag, that's biological. But the truth is that most of the time, we're not worried. Like, I don't think Shay's sitting here, and sorry, your name is, sorry? Linda. I don't think Shay's worried Linda's going to attack him during the talk. He's got his back to her. She's got a chainsaw. Be careful. Just keep an eye on her. No, but of course, most of the time, no, he didn't look. Could be sense. So most of the time, of course, we're not worried about that. But it is a human possibility. It is. But we know most of us don't take up that possibility. So what makes it happen? Well, some clever anthropologists, those researchers who study different human cultures, sifted through the anthropological record. The records of studies of different, basically tribal societies to give us a window into the human past. They sifted through these records to ask, have we had violence against women in all human cultures? Violence among men, violence against children. And here's what they found out. In these societies that have been studied over the past 150 years, they found that about half of them had violence against women, violence among men, violence against children. But the other half had little or no violence. In other words, of course, it is a human possibility, but it wasn't inevitable. So they said, well, what distinguishes societies with the violence from those with little or no violence? In every case, the societies with the various forms of violence were male-dominated societies, what we call patriarchal societies. The societies with little or no violence were societies built on a high degree of equality between women and men. Now, these societies were half male. It wasn't about the presence of males. It wasn't something about males per se that causes violence. It had to do with inequality. Because as soon as we have inequality, as soon as we have a group of power over another group, it becomes an invitation to violence. Why? Because violence becomes a means to maintain power, to maintain inequality. So that story I just recounted at the beginning of the woman who's beat up by her husband because he didn't like dinner. He didn't beat her up because he didn't like dinner. He didn't beat her up because the peas were overcooked. He didn't beat her up because there was a crease in the shirt that was supposed to be ironed. He beat her up using the violence as a tool to maintain his power in that relationship. It has to do with power. And using, just like if I want to hammer a nail in, I don't just use my hand, even though I'm a tough enough guy to do that, of course. But I would grab the hammer and make it easier to knock it. I use that hammer as a tool. He's using violence as a tool to maintain his power. And that, of course, is the first and the central insight of feminist theorists, feminist activists, looking at the nature of men's violence. It has to do with patriarchal power. And as you can see, I'm going to present to you 7 different ideas about the nature of the origins and nature of men's violence. The first is patriarchal power. The existence of male, within a male-dominated society, some men are going to use violence as a means to maintain their individual power within relationships. Whole societies will do it. We saw this in the mass rapes in Kosovo, for example, or right now in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where whole groups are sexually assaulting women using it as a method of control and power. Now, closely related, let me say this, for those who are wondering at this point, well, male-dominated society, don't we live in a society of pretty good equality now? Well, we still live in cultures in which men still make about 1.5 times what women are making. What's the percentage here in Ireland? Men make what? 75? Women make about 75%? It's usually in that range of what men make. So male-dominated society is that. Male-dominated society is one in which governments tend to be dominated by men. This is my current favorite picture of a government dominated by men. This is the North Korean parliament, or whatever it's called. A male-dominated society is one in which our leaders tend to be men. Our political leaders, our religious leaders, some we like, some we hate, but our leaders tend to be men. By the way, if you ever want to pick out a male leader in the crowd, political leader, religious leader, just watch for the guys who are waving. They all love waving. We should actually, we of course have the most popular man on the planet in the middle of this now. The history of male-dominated societies is one in which we've trained groups of men as warriors to conquer other male-dominated societies, or to defend us against those other male-dominated societies. Not only in the ancient past, as in the terracotta warriors in China, but very much to this day, as we see from these U.S. soldiers. A male-dominated society is one in which men control the economies, and what a great job my half of the species has been doing on that one in recent years, I have to say. A male-dominated society is one in which, as Alan was talking about, our sports heroes, the ones we value, are men, even if at times they've fallen from grace. A male-dominated society is one in which most of our bosses and supervisors are men. And I don't mean that male supervisors are necessarily any worse than a female supervisor. It's just meant to be a funny picture. But still, disproportionately, men are still the bosses. Men are supposed to lead the way. They're supposed to be in charge. And those are all images of a male-dominated society like we still have, in spite of progress that we've made. And so within that can lead to violence as a means of maintaining that. Closely linked to that is what women have pointed out and referred to as men's privilege, sense of privilege and entitlement. Let me just tell you a quick story about that to explain what we mean by that. One day I was taking a walk in Toronto where I live, a beautiful autumn day. The trees were orange and red and yellow and the sky was blue. And I took a walk for hours in this big park we have in downtown Toronto. It's just one of those high on life, who needs drugs sort of days. And the next day I ran into a friend of mine, a woman, and I was still going on poetically about this walk in the park, and it was just, it was so incredibly expressive. And she was just looking at me. And finally I said, "What?" And she said, "Michael, that's interesting, because I too took a walk in the park," she said, "yesterday." And I said, "Wasn't it great?" And went on again, and she just stood there like this. I said, "What?" And she said, "Michael, here's what happened to me." And she talked about her walk in the park, how she started walking along, and some guy started following her down this pathway, that pathway, back and forth. Finally, he, after she was thoroughly intimidated, he took off. He had had enough. And then she passed two men who were sitting on the park bench talking, and as she got close, they stopped talking, and they just watched her go by. There's some other event. In other words, what for me had seemed like a basic right to take a walk on a nice day in a park had been for her an experience of harassment and intimidation. So as a story of mine, the privileges I enjoy invisibly as a man. As a man, I don't think about, should I walk up to the corner at night to pick up some milk or something. I don't have to worry in my own home. I can go out on a date. Well, my wife probably wouldn't. I could go out on a date and not have to tell a friend I'm going out tonight and make sure I get in okay. These invisible privileges I enjoy as a man. But it's also a story about the privileges and entitlement those men felt they had to harass her. So women have been pointing out that violence is about privileges and entitlement. And the third point that women have been raising for years now is that the violence is about permission. The violence is about permission. By the way, there's an article on my website. Did we reproduce that? The 7 Ps of men's violence?
It's in all the folders.
Okay, you'll be able to get to that later, that reviews this. Permission. The violence exists because we as a society have allowed it to exist. So when we don't have adequate laws, that's permission. When we have adequate laws but don't train police to implement them, when we don't train judges, that is permission, and on and on. So if we don't speak out against it, that's permission. If we celebrate violence, if we celebrate the warriors, if we say that, oh, Margaret Thatcher was a great leader because she could blow up an Argentinian naval vessel and kill, how many people was it? 600 people? 700? Some huge number. This made her a great woman, a great leader. If we celebrate it that way, that's permission. But the biggest way that we give permission to violence is the silence. So do we have a police officer here by any chance? Do we have a former police officer by? Oh, we do. Could you be a judge here? Just to see.
Yeah.
No. See if you can remember your police days, just to judge if someone is giving the right answer to a question. This is a very hard thing. In your years, it's going to require your years of training. Could I have a volunteer? Your name is? Sorry? Marta said? Marta said, I'm going to ask you a really hard question. Don't get nervous. This is probably the hardest question you've ever been asked. Okay. Let's say you have an apartment, and you look out the window and you see a store being robbed. Okay? What are you going to do? Call the police? Is that the right answer? Yes! Woo! Now, here's what happens every day across Dublin, every day across Ireland. Someone hears a woman being beat up next door. A woman comes into work with a bruise or a black eye. You see a child being hit in the supermarket. Do you call the police? Do you offer help to that person? No. What we do instead, we say, oh no, it's a private matter. It's a personal matter. It's a family matter. And by doing that, we give permission. And that was as if I had said to you, so what would you do? Would you call the police? And you go, no, it's a personal matter between the robber and the store owner. Well, you wouldn't even think of saying that. I was just testing to see if you were the one person on the planet who would say that. It wouldn't even occur to you. But when it comes to men's violence against women, as well as violence against children, these are the only forms of violence that we just take as, well, it's just a personal matter. That's the permission. Now, these 3 insights have been the core of feminist analysis of men's violence, and I subscribe to them. I think they are the core. But as you can see from this title, the 7 Ps, and the fact that we only at number 3, there's a few more points that we can add. So let's look at those points. Let's see what we can add to understand why men use violence. These points have to do with men using it to enact power, to have power over someone, because we've allowed it to happen and so forth. But what else is going on? Let me tell you a story. A couple of you in this room have heard me tell the story before, but it was the most wonderful moment of my life. It was when my son was born. Now, it's true I also have a daughter. I don't want you to think you're looking at me like, what a sexist pig. He's got a son and a daughter, and the son is the most important. My daughter's a stepdaughter, and so I wasn't there for the birth. I don't know why they didn't invite me. It's a strange Canadian custom that you don't invite the future stepfather. Anyway, so there it was, my son's birth. This was 32 years ago. I was very young. I was a baby at the time. So 32 years ago. So my son had been born, for like 5 seconds, and I didn't yet know if it was a boy or a girl. Now, it's not because I'm stupid. I do know the difference between boys and girls. But because I had so many tears in my eyes, I couldn't say the little thing. And I mean the little thing on the little thing. I didn't know if it was a boy or girl until the nurse spoke. And until this point, the nurse had been speaking in her normal voice, and suddenly her voice dropped down really low, and she said, "It's a boy. What a strong little fellow." And I was totally shocked. Not because it was a boy. I had taken high school biology. I kind of figured there was a 50-50 chance of that. But I was shocked by the change in her voice and what she said. And I knew if it had been a girl, her voice would have gone up a notch and she would have said something like, "Pretty." My kid was 5 seconds old. He was being fitted for his first rugby jersey. Now, he was a strong little boy, but he was also the sweetest, most beautiful thing that ever squirmed its way on the planet. But what happens from this moment of birth? What happens from this moment of birth is you and I are bombarded with ideas, with information, with clothes, with expectations about what it means to be a boy or girl. We learn to become boys or girls. You don't have to learn to be male or female. We're born that way, these 99% of us. But we have to learn to become masculine, feminine, boy, girl, man, woman. We become gendered. Now this is an amazing process. I don't know if you'll be able to see this small sketch, but let me just give you an idea of how amazing this is. We used to think that, and educators still are stuck in this paradigm, that learning consists of learning these different facts. You know, you drill this in, you learn this thing, and you just keep learning things. And we think, this is the brain, by the way. That's the brain, these are facts, things you learn. If you can't see this in the back, it's okay. It's just scribbles, the doodle. What neuroscientists are now telling us is that the process of learning is not just learning things, but is actually developing what they call neural pathways, neural linkages. And so this process of early development is one in which we take in external reality through our senses, through our observations, through our feelings. We're stimulated, and that literally causes the development of these neural pathways, neurons, basically. Now, this process is so intense that a new baby, every single day is creating millions of new neural pathways every day. That's why babies sleep so much, because their brain is just being created in an explosive way. And what they're doing is they're literally taking in the world, not just the physical world of table and standing up and who people are. They're taking in the emotional world, the psychological world. They're taking into their developing psyche the definition of what it means to be a person, but more specifically, what it means to be a man. Let me tell you another story that illustrates that. Does anyone have a baby with them I could use? Could I use your purse in lieu of a baby? Is there anything fragile in this? Good. Okay, good. Is there any money that I can steal? Oh, sorry, former police officer back. Okay, anyway, so this day, a friend of mine was standing at a bus stop with her baby. And this day, her baby was wearing a lumberjack outfit. You know, one of those red and black check things that apparently lumberjacks would wear. So this guy comes up, a really nice guy, casual acquaintance, doesn't know anything about the baby, but a really nice guy. Takes the baby and says, "Hey, I see you have your baby." Starts throwing the baby up in the air. Whoa, what a little bruiser. What's his name? And my friend says, her name is Sarah. And he's going, "Oh, she's so cute. Look at those cutesy winksies." Now, can you imagine from birth either being treated like, "Ho," or that is going to do something to your head. And the reason you can imagine, this happened to each and every one of us. And that's why when that nurse said, "It's a boy, what a strong little fellow," we are bombarded with this day in, day out. And what we now know, what the neuroscientists are now telling us, is this is actually shaping, well, not this purse, but this behavior is shaping our brain. Don't throw around your babies, by the way, just a little tip. That's actually changing us. It's actually creating brains that are different. These images just go into us. And so we have this, we're bombarded for years with these ideas of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. Now, we've seen at the beginning that part of what it means to be a man in a male-dominated society is to have power. So we grow up as boys with these images that to be a man means to have power. And so I remember like friends teaching me how to smoke like a man. You know, how to walk, how to talk, how to not to talk, how to just to tough it out in the world, how to fight. We learn these things. We learn that we're going to be on top. We learn as men, we're told over and over again, you know, don't show feelings, don't show emotions, don't show weakness. We're bombarded with these images that to be a man means to be tough, strong, and in control. And we live in a society which backs that up. Which backs it up. It says these are the men on top. These are our heroes. So you think, if from birth we're bombarded with these images of what it means to be a man, day in, day out, if we live in a society that's male-dominated, it says men are on top. You would think that by the time that we hit, you know, our teenage years, if not a bit after, we men would feel pretty damn confident about being real men. You know, all that years of training, it goes right into our brain. But here's the thing. This is the thing some of us will be spending the day tomorrow talking about in the men's conference. But here's the thing. all that bombardment of ideas and ideals actually doesn't work very well. Because what we are told as men is that you will always be strong. You will never be weak. You will never ask for help. You will never just need to be held, need to love or to be loved. You will always have the answers. On and on. You will be invincible. And the truth is that none of us can live up to these images of masculinity. None of us can live up to that. We're never, we're not, none of us look the part. We're never buffed enough, physically, strong enough, myself accepted, and all the men in this room, of course, who are incredibly ripped. We're actually, anyway, you never have, a big enough dick, a big enough penis. I point like this because, they do hang down close to the floor. You're never manly enough. You don't make enough money. You don't have a fancy enough job. You don't order enough people around. You're not fearless enough. You're not tough enough. You're not anything enough. We cannot live up to these expectations because the expectations of manhood are impossible. So where does that lead us? Well, it leads us to this. It leads us right back to violence. I said at the beginning, following a feminist analysis, that an individual man may use violence to exercise power over someone. That's true. But here's the paradox. He may also, at the exact same moment, be using violence as a way of compensating for feeling that he's not a real man. This is a bizarre paradox. He's using violence to maintain power, but he's also using violence to prove to himself and prove to the women around him that he not just has power, but that he is a real man. So the violence becomes paradoxical. An expression of power, using violence to maintain power, but at the same time, this desperate plea to prove to himself and others that he is actually powerful. Why? Because he doesn't feel it. Because he just doesn't feel it. Because you can't live up to these expectations. So you have to use violence to prove to it. And that's why these young men, these boys in school, have the same experiences that we had when we were that age, which is you've got to fight. You've got to fight to prove that you are a real man. And if you walk away from a fight, well, I don't know what words you use here, but you're a sissy, you're whatever word you might use here. You don't stack up. You're not a real man. So you have to use violence to prove that you're a real man. So we're getting into, in this point, what I think of as the paradox of manhood. That in a male-dominated society, men have power, and yet the ways we define the power is impossible for any man to live up to. And so as a result, some men will use violence as a mechanism to compensate, for not actually feeling powerful, the means to feel powerful. So the women here, which women have worked in a shelter, or in a refuge? Some of the women here. So you probably, you're doing intake, and you're hearing, when this happened, and then you ask next, so what did he, after he had, hit you and he was settling down, what did he say? What when you ask women, what would those men then say next? Okay, you made me do it. So they know it's wrong. If you blame someone else, it's because you know you've done something wrong. So on one level, they know it's wrong. What else might they say? She deserved it. Again, not taking responsibility, externalizing the cause. What else might he say? There's a third thing that I often have been told by different women. They also hear a man saying, sorry, I won't do it again. Now, partly he doesn't want to lose her. He doesn't want her to call the police. But at that point, I actually think he believes it. And the reason he believes it is, think of this here, he was feeling insecure, he was getting pushed around at work, and real men are pushed around. He doesn't have work, men are supposed to be the providers. He's the boss at work, and he leaves work, and he can't boss anyone around. He's not feeling like a real man. What does he do? He comes home, he beats up his wife, and his masculine equilibrium has been temporarily balanced again. He feels like a real man again. Real man doesn't have to beat up a woman, and he can genuinely say, sorry, I won't do it again. Well, we know that that's just a temporary, that's just happening in that moment, that he will do it again. But that is his feeling at this point, and it tells us that this violence is not only a means to maintain power over someone, but is a way of compensating for feeling not powerful. Now I want to be clear here, this is not an excuse. This is not an excuse in any way for him enacting using violence against someone. we can't say, oh, well, he has a tough life too. But we have to understand what's happening. Now, just running through a number of things here. Closely related to this is that we turn men into pressure cookers. For the younger guys here, a pressure cooker is a pre-microwave device. And you know, if your mother, probably your mother, maybe your dad, but tell you how to use it. You know, you put the top on, you turn up the heat, and of course you couldn't. The two rules is you couldn't open it when it was going, and the second you couldn't leave it on the heat too high too long, or it would explode. Well, this is what we do with men, because one of the ways we raise boys to be men is in most cultures we say, don't show your feelings, don't have feelings. In fact, I just want to say in front of this group, I want to be open in front of this group about myself personally. I did want to tell you I did have a feeling once, and I don't know, ever had one of those? No? Never? Okay, you guys are tough here. Once? Maybe half of a feeling. You know, we're pretty tough. I mean, you know, but you know, we're not supposed to have feelings. We're not supposed to show too many emotions. I was going to bring a quote. I was just reading one of Kaufman. Is that how you pronounce his name? The novelist. One of his novels.
Tobin.
And you know, it's his novel Brooklyn, and his sister, who hasn't seen for years, is visiting him in Liverpool, and she goes to hug him, and he goes, no, you know, enough of that. You know, let's not, you know, let's not sully the moment by a hug here. This is the sense of the 1950s. So you know, these strong messages that we're not supposed to have feelings, we're not supposed to show feelings. What happens? Well, feelings are just part of our birthright as humans. Humans have feelings. That's part of who we are. And we have natural ways to deal with feelings, to discharge the buildup of energy. So when, you know, if I'm hammering something and I hit my finger, I yell and I curse, and somehow it makes the feeling go away. If I'm sad, I cry. And that's a natural mechanism to get rid of feelings. In fact, scientists have analyzed the tears you cry when you cut an onion and compared it to the tears you cry when you're sad, and it's actually different chemical composition. Literally, the tears you cry when you're sad, just like the tears you cry when you're cutting an onion, get rid of whatever acid or whatever it is in the onion. The tears you cry when you're sad, get rid of hurtful feelings, you feel better. We evolved as humans to shake when we're scared. You know why we do this? This is very cool. When you shake, your muscles twitch and they generate adrenaline. And when you generate adrenaline, you're able to react. So, you know, you're walking through the woods, a saber-toothed tiger jumps at you, you can either, you know, fight back or you can run like hell. But now if you're the cool guy in 2013, you're walking through the woods and a bear jumps in front of you, you don't shake because you're too cool for that. So you just go, bear, right? And you're dead, you know? We're not talking about useful stuff, but we've been taught don't feel, don't show feelings if you feel them. So what happens? We have feelings and they build up and they build up and they build up, ready to explode. And they explode in the one emotion that we say is okay for men in many cultures. And what that is anger. Now there's nothing wrong with anger. Anger is just an emotion. But unfortunately, if we haven't learned healthy ways to express and get rid of anger, it comes out in the form of violence. The next thing, though, and this would take a long time to get into, but I'll just briefly refer to it, psychic armor. When men are absent from nurturing, from caring for the young, what happens is that boys grow up with this image, an idealized image of what a father is, what a man is. And I don't mean just in one home where there isn't a man present because he's dying, because there's a divorce, because there's the two parents are women. I mean in society as a whole, when men aren't doing the nurturing. The images of what men are tend to be distant, tend to be remote, tend to be fantasy images. And the images that boys internalize include developing what some psychologists have called a barrier, ego barrier between themselves and others. It's like we put men in a suit of armor. And so violence can happen because for most men, our capacity to be empathetic, to feel what others feel, is reduced. Now, I'm not saying that men aren't empathetic, I think we are. But for some men, because of their own experiences, their capacity to feel what others are feeling, their empathy, is greatly reduced. And it means that those men are capable of being violent. Why? Because if you can't feel the pain you're causing, you're more likely to be able to inflict violence on someone. That would take a long time to get into, so I just going to mention that briefly. But the final cause here is the past experiences. We know from studies all over the world that men who use violence in their relationships have, in most cases, have grown up in a family where they witness violence against their mother or where they experience violence directly against them. It becomes, to be simplistic, learned behavior. It becomes acceptable behavior. It becomes just how you deal with things. But I think with boys, you can get at it, it's even more complicated because, of course, many girls grow up with that. And some go on to use violence in their adult lives, but more often they don't compared to men. So what would it be that would encourage more of those boys who grow up with that to use violence in their adult life than girls? Well, I think it goes back to the combination of all of these points together, for one thing. And think of the boy's experience. A boy is supposed to be powerful, supposed to be in control, and yet he's experiencing violence. He can't stop it, he can't control it. He must not be a real man. And so he internalizes it. He accepts it as just, well, that's the way it is, and he learns to repeat that behavior as he gets older himself. Again, these would be all big topics to discuss, and being simplistic. The reason I've painted this picture here, and now I'm going to get into, well, what we can do, how we can take this forward, is because what we can see here is the nature, the reasons for the violence is complex. So we need complex responses. So ultimately, if it's about patriarchal power, we need social equality. We need gender equality if we're going to end the violence ultimately. We need to end the permission. We need better laws. We need to keep refining our laws. We need to be training police officers and judges and social workers and teachers and doctors and nurses. We need to end the permission. But to get into these next ones, we have to raise our boys differently. We have to raise our boys not to fit into these sort of tight pants of masculinity or put on a suit of armor. But we have to raise our boys and girls really in the exact same way. Both boys and girls need, in equal doses, love and nurturing and caregiving and roughhousing and physicality. We have to stop raising our boys and girls as from two different planets, to refer to that awful bestseller from a number of years ago. Because actually we're not from Mars and Venus, we all are right here on Earth. And so we have to really transform the ways that we raise boys to be men. We have to transform, to do that, we have to transform fatherhood. So men are equally involved in domestic work, as caregivers, as nurturers. To do that, we need campaigns to popularize that. We need changes in laws. Right now, just if you swam northwest for quite a while, hit Iceland, Iceland has just changed their law on parental leave. And now the mother gets 5 months off, the father gets 5 months off, and they have, I think there's 2, 3, 5 months that they can share, or either of them can use. And they don't even have to take 5 solid months off. You can each work half-time for those 5 months. They're developing these incredibly flexible responses to really transform fatherhood, which will transform how we raise children, how boys grow up thinking about what it means to be a man. We have to stop, putting boys into a pressure cooker with these expectations. Act like a man, tough it out. Most of us probably had a coach who humiliated the boys. We raise boys through humiliation. We've got to stop that. We can't humiliate the boy who cries. We can't humiliate the boy who's not tough enough in sports. How often I don't know if you got the same here, but a coach would say, oh, stop playing like girls. Stop throwing like a girl, whatever it is. Both sexist and insulting to women and using humiliation as a way of raising boys. We've just got to stop all that. So in the past experiences, we have to transform the lives of boys so they're not going to just repeat these things. And I mentioned in terms of past experiences, the experience of a boy who grows up with abuse, think then of when we add other levels of oppression. If a boy grows up experiencing racism, if a boy is discriminated because of his accent, his language, his religion, the color of his skin, whatever it might be, and we're just dumping on more levels of hurt and humiliation he has to fight his way out of. So we need these different things, but the one thing I just want to spend a few minutes before my time is up to talk about is campaigning to make a difference. Because when we take these messages into our work, they have huge implications. If we're doing work with men who use violence, we have to get away from the framework that's just sitting them down around a table and telling them what a bunch of shits they are. They already know what a bunch of shits they are. We don't have to tell them that. And so it's probably this U.S. model of the perpetrator program that is just sort of, throw these men against the wall just as if, you're doing a police interrogation. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I won't pick on you ever again. But, it's not the U.S. model that, just you're up against the wall. But really reaching out to these men with a challenge and saying, whatever happened to you, your behavior is inexcusable. We will not stay silent. But at the same time, reaching out with compassion to another human being, knowing this human being is probably someone who grew up with violence, who was probably abused themselves. We're going to say, that's not an excuse for what you do, but we're going to reach out to you with empathy, with compassion, so you can change. And that's not for everyone. I'm not saying everyone here should be doing that. But those who are doing that work have to understand that he's using violence both as a means of maintaining power, but also out of his own paradoxical experiences of masculinity. And if we don't reach out to the whole human being, we're not going to get anywhere. I want to just focus for my last thoughts on campaigning, and here talk about the White Ribbon Campaign, which is a campaign that three of us started in 1991, sitting around a table, a couple different tables in my kitchen and another friend's kitchen or living room. We were inspired by the work for many years in the women's movement in Canada. We were horrified, as other Canadians were, by a national tragedy that we had in 1989 when 14 women were murdered by a guy who blamed feminists for his problems, and that really galvanized my country. But we felt that men had to do something. We needed to speak out. So we started this campaign with the white ribbon as a symbol. There's my white ribbon right there. And it was a pretty simple idea. And it spread quickly across Canada. By this past year, it spread to about 75 countries around the world. Some countries, like Estonia, are come and gone, but it spread around the world. And I just want to tell you a little bit about it as a pretty unusual sort of campaign. It has some fundamental beliefs that most men don't commit violence against women, but most of us have been silent. So a lot of the focus has been on ending men's silence, because we believe that through that silence, we allow the violence to continue. The white ribbon itself, the campaign is not an act of collective guilt, but it's saying to men, we need to take collective responsibility for change. The ribbon itself is, when I wear a ribbon, or I'll show you how easy it is to start a white ribbon campaign. I'm just going to tear this piece of paper. Do we have any tape? We don't have any tape handy. But anyway, there I just made a white ribbon. If I had a piece of masking tape, I would, I could put that on. That's how easy it is. But when I wear a white ribbon or a white ribbon hat or a shirt or put it up a poster up, it's not to say to the women, look what a good guy I am. No, what it is, it's a public promise. I'm making a promise not to commit, condone, to excuse, or remain silent about violence against women. And the ribbon, of course, is not only a personal pledge, but it's a call on governments to adopt and enforce laws and properly support religious programs. But enough of, it's a catalyst for change. But enough of words. Let me just share some pictures. I hope you can see them okay in the light. We opted for light in the room as opposed to clarity, but who knows. Just to give you some images around the world to see what white ribbon looks like. This is in Brazil. The biggest thing that happens every year in Brazil is carnival. So there, groups of men go into their carnival parades with white ribbon banners. Here also in Brazil, they've adapted the ribbon. They've added their national colors. They don't have a history of wearing these silly ribbon things. So they do as a cloth bracelet, because they have a religious tradition of wearing these cloth bracelets. They've enlisted well-known men, as we do in many countries. These are four famous comedians, looking very serious, saying violence against women is no laughing matter. Some countries use traditional forms of organizing. These men in Namibia and Southwest Africa were rallying outside of their parliament when there was a proposed law that for the first time in Namibia was going to make rape in marriage a crime. The media was saying, oh, women, this is a women's concern. Men don't support this. These men gathered and said, we do support it. In Lebanon, just again, called public attention, these ribbons draped around some huge tree, and it became a way for people to come and say, what are you doing? And talk to people going by. 1 year in Pakistan, their campaign, they organized students to go to gas stations. So when men pulled up, to fill up their car with gas, there'd be a student there giving them a white ribbon, explaining to them about the problem of violence against women. Also in Pakistan, nighttime vigil, you can sort of see. Oh, Ireland, there we are. China, this big public banner that men are invited to sign a pledge not to commit, condone, or remain silent about violence against women. This is the southernmost White Ribbon campaign. This is in Antarctica. I think the boat is stuck, I'm not sure. But anyway, that looks cool, so put that out there. Bangladesh. This is my favorite White Ribbon picture. This is in Cambodia, I don't know what city. But this little boy was downtown one day in his town, and he saw people giving out white ribbons. As a curious young kid, he said, "What's that?" And they explained to him what the white ribbon was. And he said, "I know all about that because my dad beats up my mom." And then he did what most kids do, what many kids will do. He said, "Can I help?" And here he is giving out the white ribbon to a street vendor who's selling some sort of thing. The vendor is looking at this ribbon going, "What the heck is this?" Except for the Cambodian. Cambodian is weak, so I'll skip that. Well, I probably could have said anything, and you would have believed it was Cambodian. Anyway, he's saying in Cambodia, "What the heck is this?" And this little boy is pointing to the ribbon, explaining to him about the problem of violence against women. Excuse me. He could have been just a victim of violence. He could have been someone who went on to perpetrate it himself. Instead, he's become an educator for change. That's the spirit of white women. In many countries, it's been women who started the campaign. Police officers in Guatemala, the two famous actors in China. In many countries, using some pretty sort of stereotypical pictures. But why? We want to make it safe for boys and for men to take part. We discourage images that just show the beat up woman, and rather say let's try to have positive images, because we know through positive images of masculinity, positive images of men speaking out, we're actually going to have a much greater audience. We're going to have men listening to what we're saying. This picture down here, this little Maori boy, Aboriginal boy from New Zealand standing in front of motorcycles. That's because every year in New Zealand, there's a cross New Zealand motorcycle ride. These ex-bikers, motorcycle gang members, have organized this cross New Zealand motorcycle ride, and they ride into town on their Harley Davidsons, and they get off, and the guys come over talking about their bikes, and what these bikers answer back is talking about the problem of violence against women. This one is a rugby player. And this fellow apparently would be known by everyone in Australia. Do we have any rugby fans here? Can you see what's wrong with this picture? You can't see it. What can you?
He's wearing an all-black jersey.
Yeah, he's wearing the wrong jersey. He's wearing a jersey from New Zealand. They're arch rivals. But he's saying this is worth the embarrassment. He said basically, and he's like the star of the green and the gold. He said, I fought hard to wear the green and the gold. So is this embarrassing? Yes, but it's even more embarrassing to know that my girls are growing up in a country where 1 in 2 women, or sorry, 1 in 4 women, 1 in 3 women, I can't see it, will be victims of violence in their lifetime. So if this will make men in Australia notice and listen, it's worth the embarrassment. This the symbol adopted. So do you see the pattern here? The pattern is there's no pattern, because we are a decentralized campaign. We believe that men and women know best in their own country, in their own communities, how to reach the men and boys around them. These are, in Canada, our First Nations peoples and Coastal State development. We know that there's resistance to this campaign based on fear, and so we work through that with positive messages about change, including in Canada anyway, our slogan is "Our future has no bias." So positive images of masculinity, sports images, whatever it is, posters where people can take part. This is an empty poster that might go up in a school, a big banner. There's some paint, and boys are meant to put their handprints on. These hands will not be used in violence. Materials like the teachers. So where do I want to end? And I do have to end now. Turn it over to our next speaker. Well, let me say this, and we're going to have time this afternoon for discussion of some of these issues. But what we're seeing right now around the world is an incredible change, propelled by the energy, the heroism of so many women. But finally, men are stepping forward. And when men step forward, it means that suddenly it becomes safe for other men to step forward. We think that all this work must be so hard to engage men. But I believe that men have waited their whole life, to be welcomed into a conversation about what it means to be a man, to be relieved of this burden of always having to be tough and strong and in control and not having an emotion and so forth. And if we can create the conditions, those safe environments, the welcome to men, to be partners in change, amazing things happen. And I want to end with two short stories to show that. One was told to me a number of years ago now by a colleague from Pakistan. He's from the Swat region of Pakistan, a remote tribal region, which I never even heard of when he told me the story a number of years ago. Although, of course, it's been in the news, because last year is where all the civil war was happening in Pakistan. He came from the remote Swat region of Pakistan. He went off to law school. And while he was at law school in the capital, there was a coup d'etat. A general came to power. And this general, to curry the favor of the fundamentalist types, enacted what they called the Hudud Ordinances. Anyone ever heard of this, the Hudud Ordinances? One of these rules said that if a woman was raped, for her to prove it, she had to come up with 4 male witnesses. Guess how often she could prove it? Never. What would then happen is that she would then be charged with adultery. And if found guilty, she could be thrown into prison for a long time or even executed. This guy comes back from law school and says, wait a minute, this isn't right. This is everything that I've been learning about the Pakistani legal tradition says that this is wrong. And he says, of course, he's a Muslim. And he says, this is against my religion, he says. So he starts defending these women. And he starts winning in their defense. Well, the powers that be, Pakistan, the region of Pakistan, trumped up some charges, and they threw him into prison. Now, has anyone here ever been in a prison? I don't mean, doing 5 to 10 for a robbery, but for work. Some of you social workers. Prisons in Ireland, which is a rich country in spite of the last few years. When in a rich country, prisons are hellholes, even in a wonderful country like this. They're told they're the worst places on the planet. If they're that bad here, can you imagine what a prison would be like in the remote Swat region of Pakistan? Like beyond hell. But it gets worse. Imagine what happened to him when the other male prisoners found out why he was in prison. Imagine for a second what they did to him. And whatever you just imagine, you're probably wrong. Because when those men in prison found out that he was in prison for defending the women in their communities, they all went on a hunger strike. This was a place that didn't have much food, probably. They all went on a hunger strike. They said, we will not eat until you let our brother out of this prison. And they won. And they won. But what I want to say to you here is that luckily most of us don't have to go to prison for these ideals. Most of us don't have to. Sometimes all it takes is one word. And here's a word I want to share particularly with the young men sitting at the back table. Share this with you. This is a story, you'll get the idea here, even though the situation will be different than the one that you're in. A student came up to me, older than these fellows. He was 21. And he told me a story about how he and his friends, whenever it was one of their birthdays, they all went together to the strip club. And, I'm not equating going to a strip club with sexual assault or beating someone up. Although we do know that many of the women in these clubs have been trafficked. So we are getting to the same degree of crime and violence. But they just, it's part of the spectrum anyway of sexism and degradation. But they religiously went to the strip club whenever it was one of their birthdays until one night when the guy telling me the story made a decision. It was his last year of university. He knew there was one more birthday. He made a decision because he knew there was that one night came when there was a knock on his door. He opened his door. All the guys were standing there and they said, let's go. He said one word, and the word was no. But they looked at him, and he said, John, are you sick tonight? And they said, no. And the next one said, are you big test? And he said, no. Of course, then the homophobia had to come up. You haven't changed teams on us, have you? No. So why can't you come, John? And he said, I just don't like going. The next one looked at him and said, what do you mean you don't like going? I don't like going either. Whenever I go, my girlfriend don't speak to me for like a month afterwards. The next one said, I don't like going either. It's against my religion. The next one said, I just feel dirty afterwards. Like I need to take a shower. The next one said, I like seeing women without their clothes on, but not like that. Not that you have to pay for it like that. It just felt wrong. They went around this group that religiously for 4 years had been going to the strip club whenever it was one of their birthdays.
Because none of these big, strong men had the courage to pull together 2 words from the English alphabet and say no. And that's all it took. That is what we are doing today. That's what the work of the Men's Development Network is doing. It's saying no to the violence with a strong, proud voice, standing alongside our sisters, saying our sisters have stood alone too long, and they have a right to have us speaking loudly at their side in support, with one voice at times, with different voices at other times, and speaking out loudly to our brothers, our fathers, our sons, and our friends, saying no, but also saying yes, because this isn't ultimately a campaign of no. This is ultimately a campaign of yes. It is yes to healthy relationships. It's yes to better communications. It's yes to better sex. It's yes to a life where we are transforming what it means to be men and women, what it means to be a father, for example. We are saying yes. And what we are doing together today as we spend this day together, what you are doing in your work, is by working together as women and men, as well as at times on our own, what we are doing is creating a far better world for women. But you know what? We're also creating a far better world for men. And most importantly, we're creating a far, far better world for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you very much.